The Espionage Act, very big stuff.
They're investigating the former president.
20 boxes of papers.
We are hearing what President Trump's defense may be.
I had these boxes. Why did you want them?
This is a remarkably broad law.
Usually in espionage, there's country A and country B.
NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden.
WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange.
Former CIA officer John Kurokawa. There's no way I said that right.
Now officially charged with espionage.
The Espionage Act.
Espionage.
The Espionage Act.
Donald Trump's own administration prosecuted 5 media sources.
If you tell the world about our crimes, then we're coming to get you. Espionage Act.
In June 2023, Donald Trump was charged with something called the Espionage Act of 1917. If that law sounds familiar, you've probably heard it in a very different context. Until that point, I'd always associate the Espionage Act with this guy. I got introduced to the Espionage Act shortly after Julian Assange was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy in London and charged with 18 counts under the same law. When we hear Espionage Act, we think of whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. But Trump's case for espionage surprised many, because it ran different than those more familiar cases of the time, some of which he himself pursued. So what is this law even? The Espionage Act, a legislation passed quickly into law during wartime over a century ago. What do the President of the United States and the founder of WikiLeaks have to do with espionage now? What is espionage even? Spies, secret missions, the future of democracy on the line, the safety of ridiculously beautiful love interests in tight dresses. We tend to think of espionage with the image of the 007s and Natasha Romanoffs, the Harry Harts from Kingsman, or the Henry Cavill in That Man from Uncle One. Or maybe they're adversaries, agents of a foreign power out to destroy the world, or at least the current order. But how many of those exist outside of fiction? And how much does the Espionage Act have to do with this classic idea of espionage, really? Have real spies like this been caught, tried, and convicted? It is hard to imagine either Trump or Assange in these roles. On the 24th of June 2024, while I was writing this essay, Julian Assange was released from Belmarsh prison, where he spent years with no conviction but awaiting extradition. He had to admit guilt to one charge under the Espionage Act for conspiring to commit computer intrusion. He's now officially a convicted spy. But is he really? The Espionage Act was from its beginning, and still is, a very controversial text, while its role in the law, politics, society, and the media has been changing throughout the years. People convicted under the Espionage Act are immensely different in their actions, convictions, and motivations. In order to understand better what the Espionage Act is about, I decided to look into its history, and more specifically, into the lives and actions of those convicted as spies since the inception of the law in 1917. So here is everyone ever convicted under the Espionage Act. Okay, so let's look at how the Espionage Act came to be and what it actually says. The Espionage Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on June 15, 1917, just 2 months after the US joined the European War in April. It was passed so quickly that Congress barely saw it. In the rush, it seems it wasn't thought through very well. Its confusing text would puzzle lawyers and academics for a century. So, to this day. President Wilson had proposed the law some years prior from fear of Japanese spies. He and some members of Congress and prominent political figures were pushing for a spy law for quite some time. Many others had concerns about it. The original draft of the Espionage Act had some dubious clauses in it that many thought were unconstitutional, as they sounded a lot like an attempt of censorship. But what brought politicians to push for a spies law in the first place? There's disloyalty active in the US, and it must be absolutely crushed. These are President Woodrow Wilson's words in a speech he gave on Flag Day. That was actually the day before the Espionage Act was signed. The president's party ran on a platform of antagonizing foreign and foreign-born Americans. The war in Europe had been going on for 3 years now, and anti-German and anti-foreign sentiment was common to the scale of a panic. Germans had filled our unsuspecting communities with vicious spies and conspirators and sought to corrupt the opinion of the people. More than that, the spy novel was born and popularized in the beginning of the century. As the most popular genre of the time, it contributed to people's intensifying paranoia of spies. Other countries like Britain, with its Official Secrets Act, and France had already established spy laws. The New York Times contributed to the craze with headlines saying that there are spies at work in every nation at all times. A strong sense of nationalism was the spirit of the American government. The law was passed with more nationalist sentiment and panic than thought and consideration. Willed into being by the fears of the men who produced them, men who were concerned above all with preserving the hierarchical imperial order they believed in. That order was not only threatened by foreigners. Political dissidents like anarchists and communists had successfully assassinated heads of state in Austria, France, Italy, Greece, the US, Russia twice, and Portugal in the 3 decades prior to signing the Espionage Act. Labor activists, pacifists, the rise of socialist movements were also threatening the imperial order. The establishment media did help these narratives by equating the German enemy with anyone that stood against the war effort, like pacifists and socialists. German sympathizers are now working along lines that tend to cover the chances of detection. Many of them have joined the Socialist Party and are preaching sedition under the guise of socialist doctrine. Basically, anybody that opposed the war in any form was seen as a danger to the cause, and so was associated by politicians and some media, like the New York Times, with a German sympathizer. A pacifist would be considered rooting for the enemy, in that sense. The Espionage Act was actually proposed as a part of an omnibus of laws relating to defense policy and foreign relations. Sections 793 and 794, which basically constitute the Espionage Act today, were not given much consideration. They were largely copied from the Defense Secrets Act that was passed 6 years prior. Section 794 criminalizes what we might think of as traditional espionage. It makes it illegal to collect information for a foreign government. Section 793, though, is murkier. It contains 6 complicated clauses intended to protect secrets by making it illegal to gather or transfer information without authorization. What information that entails was never defined. That's decades before Harry Truman established the classification system of confidential secret and top secret, which has its own problems, which we'll hopefully get to in another video. Section 793 forbids gathering information in relation to the national defense and sharing it with anyone unauthorized to have it, without explaining either what that information is or who is authorized or not authorized to have it. Made even more confusing by one section that actually uses the words public defense rather than national defense, without defining what that means as well. The 1971 Pentagon Papers trial was the first and last time the Supreme Court was concerned with the meaning of the text. The judge called it a singularly opaque statute, and 2 years later, a couple of law professors wrote 160 pages of legal analysis of the law before giving up and declaring, "The longer we looked, the less we saw. The statutes implicably resist the effort to understand." The confusing text of sections 793 and 794 were not even the biggest problem with the initial draft of the Espionage Act. Section 2C, which President Wilson was strongly pushing for, stirred a lot of controversy. It called for censorship of the post, essentially the press, during wartime, and more or less gave the president the power to censorship in public defense interest. Again, different than national defense, and once again, not defined at all. Understandably, a lot of people felt that this clause goes against the First Amendment right of free speech and freedom of the press. A Senator Cummins said that Section 2C is an absolute suppression of free speech and an absolute overthrow of a free press. The newspaper industry also rallied against it. The New York Times described it as a monstrous abuse of power and an insidious assault upon the very foundations which underline our free institutions. Section 2C would be in the way of reporting news from the war, for example. A petition was signed by 600,000 Americans. On the day the Espionage Act got voted in, Section 2C was cut narrowly with 39 to 38 votes, and President Wilson reluctantly signed the law without it. While people were focused on Section 2C, though, other problematic parts of the law were passed without much attention paid to them. Clause 794B, for example, prohibited publishing information that should not be in the hands of the enemy, without defining the limits of that information or what will happen if a journalist publishes information for the benefit of the people. This section prompted the overwhelming majority of Espionage Act indictments during the war for obstruction of the draft. So, speaking against the military draft would be considered an obstruction of the war effort, and so something that an enemy or a spy would do. Another one gave the Postmaster General authority to ban the mail's publications that violated any provisions of the Espionage Act. In May 1918, Congress introduced an amendment to the Espionage Act that became known as the Sedition Act. It made it illegal to criticize the government or its involvement in the war. That was speech that cast the government or the war effort in a negative light or interfered with the sale of government bonds. It forbade the use of disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about the United States government, its flag, or its armed forces, or that caused others to view the American government or its institutions with contempt. The Sedition Act forbade that dangerous form of propaganda known as pacifism, as Sam Lebovic says in his book State of Silence. The Senate passed the Sedition Act on May 4th, 1918, with a 2-to-1 ratio, and 3 days later, the House approved it by 293 to 1 votes. The 1 vote against was the only socialist in Congress. The time of the war was a dark time for freedom of speech. Even without the censorship clause 2C, dissident voices and press were silenced. The Postmaster General started censoring the mail by not delivering certain editions. By the end of the war, that were 75 newspapers, 45 of which were socialist. More than 2,000 people were charged with speech crimes during the war, and many of the cases were laughably minor. A man in Iowa who attended a meeting applauded some seditious statement and donated a quarter, for which he got a year in jail. A film director in Michigan made a pro-war film about the American Revolution, but in depicting British war crimes, he showed a current ally in a bad light, getting himself a 10-year sentence. Another man said to a relative that he hopes the US government goes to hell after being pressured into buying a Liberty bond. That was 20 years. A pastor in Vermont was sentenced to 15 years for distributing a pacifist pamphlet based on the teachings of Christ. A lot was done to ensure the US's unquestioned involvement in the war and to preserve the established order in a time when a world war was shaking its foundations. The Espionage Act was presented to the public as an attempt to deal with German spies and enemies of the US. But its conception might have been with a different purpose. Lebovic puts it best in his book. At the heart of the Espionage Act were unprecedented measures to control the US public sphere. During the war, the state would use the Espionage Act not to protect secrets, but to police the speech of dissidents. I know I said everybody, but this is actually everybody whose name I can find and just in general information about them. For example, I will not be naming individually the 101 union members arrested and tried at the same time in the first year of the Espionage Act. I will go through the cases roughly chronologically, starting from 1917 until the time I'm writing this. Since that's a lot of people, all of which led incredibly interesting lives, most of whom have biographies, autobiographies, wrote books themselves. There is no way that this video can be an exhaustive account of their lives or even their lawsuits. That's why I aim to provide an overview of their lives, beliefs, reasons, and actions, especially in relation to their Espionage Act conviction. For my research, I use mostly Sam Lebovic's State of Silence that goes through the history of the Espionage Act in a very comprehensive way, and A Century of Repression, the Espionage Act and the Freedom of the Press by Carey, Shenkman, and Ralph Engelman, which discusses it specifically in its relationship to the media. While these books are very detailed and also retell cases where the Espionage Act charges did not end in convictions, I will not be doing that. I will talk only about people convicted under the Espionage Act and just mention in passing significant cases like Daniel Ellsberg's Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War, for example, that ended in a mistrial, or John Kiriakou's 2012 case over the leaking of US torture programs, in which he was charged under the Espionage Act, but consequently convicted under the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. Chicago, April Fool's Day, 1918. William Big Bill Haywood is the main defendant in an Espionage Act case against 101 Wobblies, or members of the Industrial Workers of the World, the most radical labor organization in American history, and one that he himself established. 7 months earlier, the Bureau of Investigation raided all the offices of the union and the homes of the most prominent members, seizing tons of seditious materials. No wonder Big Bill was the face of these trials. He was the most feared and hated union organizer at the time. A radical and advocate for direct action and violence against the oppressor class, he had a long history of jabs with the law and the existing order. Born in Utah in 1869, he lost his father to pneumonia at only 3 years old. At age 9, he lost his right eye while whittling a slingshot with a knife. He never replaced it with a glass one, and whenever photographed throughout his life, he would always offer his left profile. The same year, he worked in a mine for the first time. The economic conditions of his family that forced him to work from such an early age also prevented him from having much of a formal education. The story of his radicalization can be traced back to the Haymarket riots of 1886 and the trials that followed. Now, remember the Haymarket riots because they're the origin story for a lot of these people. The labor demonstration at Haymarket Square in Chicago, protesting for an 8-hour workday and better working conditions, ended bloody after the police opened fire on the crowd in retaliation to a dynamite bomb thrown at them. 8 anarchists were charged and 4 were executed, even though there was no significant evidence that it was any of them. Haywood was so affected by this that after his death, half of his ashes were spread in Chicago near the monument of the Haymarket anarchists. A decade later, while he worked at a silver mine in Idaho, he joined the Western Federation of Miners, or the WFM. Over the next decade, he would rise through the ranks of union organizations. In 1901, a series of failed WFM strikes led him to believe in the need of one big union, a unity of workers that would garner stronger support for individual labor causes. In 1905, he had a key role in establishing the IWW, and he became its leader in 1915 as he continued to organize strikes and work for labor causes. Big Bill turned out to be a powerful speaker. He advocated for direct action, the use of tactics like civil disobedience, strikes, and even violence over negotiation to achieve the goals of the labor movement. Such beliefs of his made him difficult even with his peers. He was a controversial figure both within the labor organizations and the Socialist Party. He also believed in a new type of a union. The Industrial Workers of the World advocates revolutionary industrial unionism, with ties to socialist, syndicalist, and anarchist labor movements. Industrial unionism is the idea that workers within one industry should unite, rather than based on their craft. For example, the recently established Starbucks union in the US can be seen as an industrial union, as all Starbucks workers can join it, no matter if they are baristas, managers, cashiers, etc. The IWW actually led a campaign for a Starbucks union in 2004. During the First World War, the IWW's calls for strikes, combined with a general condemnation of capitalism and imperial wars, is what got its members in trouble a lot of the time. Striking was more or less illegal in wartime. As we saw, obstruction of the war effort was seen as an act of treason. The government considered that if you halt the production of whichever industry by striking, you're essentially aiding the enemy. It wouldn't help the Wobblies that on top of the strikes, they held a strong position against the war and the draft. In the course of the war, a total of 400 IWW activists would be indicted for violating the Espionage Act. From the 166 arrests in the September raids, 101 went to trial, charged with a total of 17,022 violations of the Espionage Act. All of them were convicted under the Espionage Act for obstructing the war effort. While usually the sentence would be 2 years of prison time and $10,000 fine, 14 of the 101 Wobblies were sentenced to 20 years. Bill Haywood was one of them. He wouldn't serve it all, though. In March 1921, while out on appeal, he escaped bail and fled to Russia. As a lifelong socialist by belief and a supporter of the Bolshevik Revolution, he was received well. After his death, half of his ashes were buried in the Kremlin Wall necropolis, making him only one of 4 Americans to have his resting place there. Big Bill Haywood is considered one of the most radical syndicalists and labor rights activists, one of the most famous and controversial of his time. Another big figure, more famous even than Big Bill, was also at the center of the labor movements and the social politics at the end of the 20th century. Yet another co-founder of the IWW. A 5-time presidential candidate on the socialist ticket, Eugene V. Debs is to this day the left's candidate closest to the presidency. In the 1912 election, he got 6% of the vote, or 901,551 votes. In 1917, he ran for the last time, this time from prison, although he promised to pardon himself if elected. Why was he in prison? Well, just like his buddy Big Bill, he was slightly inconvenient to the war machine, and he was also slightly too big not to be heard. His 1917 conviction under the Espionage Act for a speech that he gave, and we're gonna get to that speech, was not his first clash with the law. In 1894, his role in organizing and leading the Pullman strikes against the Pullman factory in Chicago, its monopolization of the railroad industry and harsh working conditions, got him convicted for defying a court order to dissolve the strike. He served 6 months in prison. While he started as a Democrat, after being released from prison, Debs became a loud advocate for socialism, establishing the precursor of the SPA, the Socialist Party of America. Now to the speech. On 16th of July 1917, Eugene Debs made a speech in Canton, Ohio, urging resistance to the military draft. Or at least that's what he was charged with. In truth, the speech was incredibly vague, intentionally so. Debs was a seasoned politician and orator, and he knew the dangers of such a speech in a time of serious political oppression of pacifists. Ironically, the speech that got him arrested began like this.
It is extremely dangerous to exercise the constitutional right of free speech in a country fighting to make democracy safe for the world. I realize in speaking to you this afternoon that there are certain limitations placed upon the right of free speech. I must be extremely careful, prudent as to what I say, and even more careful and prudent as to how I say it. I may not be able to say all I think, but I'm not going to say anything that I do not think. And I would rather 1,000 times be a free soul in jail than a sycophant or coward on the streets.
Debs invites arrest, said one headline after his speech. It was written by the pro-war journalist Clyde Miller. He even ran an editorial with a promise from the prosecutor Edwin Wirtz to indict Debs. In fact, Miller and Wirtz were old friends. When the journalist called Wirtz and gave him his version of the speech, he asked, "Are you going to let this fellow get away with it?" "No man is too big to violate the Espionage Act," answered Wirtz. "I will ask for his indictment." However, when Wirtz finally saw a copy of the speech, he wasn't so sure that there was a case there. The Justice Department agreed that the case was not at all a clear violation. The DOJ wrote that it does not feel strongly convinced that a prosecution is advisable. But Wirtz felt trapped as he had already promised prosecution in that editorial from before. He charged Debs with 10 violations of the Espionage Act, including some under the Sedition Act. He needed to prove 3 things. First, that Debs expressed anti-war and anti-draft opinions in his speech, which he did by selectively quoting the speech. Second, that Debs intended to disrupt the war, which was proven by Debs' activity in the IWW, the SPA, and other meetings and speeches. And third, that the speech could be heard by men of drafting age, which was easily established by testimonials of people who attended the meeting. At the hearing, the defense called no witnesses. Instead, they insisted Debs himself spoke. He spoke for 2 hours about his disillusionment with the system, about the rights of the working class, and his belief in change by peaceful means. His legal team argued that if his speech was criminal, then the Espionage Act is unconstitutional. To no success. Eugene V. Debs was sentenced on September 18, 1918, to 10 years in prison, and was also disenfranchised for life. Woodrow Wilson called him a traitor to his country. From his sentence hearing, we have his best-remembered statement.
Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest on earth. I said then and I say now that while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free.
Eugene Debs' conviction sparked nationwide protests. He was released in 1921 after President Hoover commuted his sentence, along with a lot of anti-war activists of World War I. In 1924, Debs was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his peace efforts during the war. Speaking of speeches, here are some more people that got convicted under the Espionage Act, basically for public speaking. John J. Ballum, Frederick Kraft, and Emil Herman were socialist political figures and activists, but they are mostly remembered for their Espionage Act trials, which once again showed the effects of the new war laws on freedom of speech. John Ballum was sentenced to 1 year for a speech against America's participation in the war. Newspapers quoted him saying, "Working men should not go to war because they will be required to kill other working men in a different uniform." He said in his speech, "I don't care one snap of my finger for the millions of lives that have been lost. I am not a sentimentalist. The working class can give its life and blood, if it chooses to protect the master class. But I have no sympathy for them. I don't deplore this war. I am not a pacifist, nor is the IWW. The IWW has declared war upon the capitalist class. What would you advise a man joining the army?" asked someone in the crowd. "I never give a man advice. Obey your own conscience. There is no higher law." While Ballum's speech hardly sounds like a concrete call to resist the draft, Frederick Kraft was convicted for even less. On August 9, 1917, Kraft was addressing a large open-air meeting in New Jersey. He had to call the police after a couple of agitators started disrupting the meeting, but the police instead arrested him for holding a meeting without a permit. He was then charged under the Espionage Act for seditious statements like, "I can't see how the government can compel troops to France," and "If it was up to me, I'd tell them to go to hell. It's a damn shame." The prosecution ignored the testimonies of 12 witnesses that claimed he actually never said those things. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison and a $1,000 fine. 5 years! Not even Eugene Debs got a sentence like this. In 1919, he was the only one to receive a full pardon by President Wilson. The allegations of uttering seditious statements is somehow not the most ridiculous crime. Emil Herman was an anti-war activist. He was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his parents moved to the States when he was 3 years old. The fact that he was from foreign descent did not help his case in the anti-German nationalist climate of World War I. What was his crime that led to his conviction under the Espionage Act and a sentence of 10 years? Stickers. Pamphlets and stickers that were found during the raid of his office and were classified as seditious materials. One of these stickers read a quote falsely attributed to Jack London that read, "Young man, the lowest aim in your life is to be a good soldier. The good soldier never tries to distinguish right from wrong. He never thinks, never reasons, he only obeys. No man can fall lower than a soldier. Young man, don't be a soldier, be a man." Yes, these words obviously have an anti-war sentiment to them, but Herman did not even have to speak them to be convicted. He served just over 3 years of his 10-year sentence before he was pardoned. After he was released, he continued to be a pacifist activist, opposing all war.
Good evening. What you're about to witness is an unrehearsed, uncensored interview. If you are now and always have been a loyal American, as you say and have said many times, how do you justify this contempt for American law and American authority?
Earl Browder is the closest that we get to an actual spy from this era, even though his spying activities were not even chronologically here. He had a long and very interesting history with the American Socialist and Communist parties. He was General Secretary of the CPUSA in the 30s and 40s, and the most recognizable figure connected to US communism. In 1946, he was expelled from the Communist Party, however. He stayed a proponent of close US-USSR relationships even during the Red Scare of the McCarthy era, while the party's position was changing at that time. Anyways, spying. In 1957, he was on the Mike Wallace interview, where he was questioned about his expulsion from the Communist Party and also whether he has any relations to the USSR. While he claimed that him leaving the CPUSA was the best thing that could happen to him, given the changing direction of the party, he denied any activity connected to Russia. Later in the 1990s, with the declassification of the Venona Project, a counterintelligence program that started during World War II and continued for 37 years, it came to light that he was involved in the potential recruitment of spies for the USSR. He was never prosecuted for that because these revelations came after his death. However, he was tried under the Espionage Act during World War I, like many others, as a pacifist and conscientious objector. He was sentenced to 2 years, of which he served about 1.
I do not have contempt for American law and American authority. In 1917, for example, what I got into trouble about was the fact that I was trying to defend the American Constitution against those who were revising it outside the due process by enacting the draft law. I was one of those who probably represented a majority of America at that time who thought it was a mistake for America to get into the European war.
Remember the 101 members of the IWW that were tried in the beginning of the war? Here's one that I didn't mention before. Ralph Chaplin was an artist, poet, and a labor activist, also an anarchist like many of the IWW members. He was 7 during the Pullman strike that Eugene Debs led, when he saw a striker get shot by the police. The strike, along with the Mexican Revolution and the Zapatismo movement, shaped his anarchist beliefs. For obstructing the draft and the war effort, he got a 20-year sentence, of which he served 4. He continued to write poems from prison. When he was out, he wrote an autobiography called Wobbly. He's also credited with drawing the black cat that is the anarcho-syndicalist symbol. He wrote many labor-oriented poems, including the text of the Solidarity Forever Union anthem. The song has been sung and changed throughout the years and through different movements. In the 1970s, for example, women added a verse to reflect their concerns as union members. The song also appears in the 2014 film Pride, where members of the LGBTQA+ community sing it in support of a minor strike. And I just want to mention the movie here because it's such a great movie and I can't believe that I didn't know about it before I was doing this research. I recognize 6 actors from the trailer alone. It's just a great story about solidarity and intersectional activism, and I think everyone should go and watch it.
But the union makes us strong.
Die! Your gays have arrived!
So anarchism as a leftist movement had long had intersections with feminism and queer movements. Anarcho-feminists of the time were not uncommon, and women's rights were always connected in these movements to the class fight. One of these anarchist women and yet another member of the IWW arrested with the rest, their stenographer actually, was Louise Olivero. On November 30th, 1917, she was given a 10-year sentence for obstructing the draft after she printed a leaflet advising young men of their legal rights when it comes to refusing to serve. Her leaflet was a reaction to a politician's pro-war speech that said, "Don't argue about the cause of war, or whether we should or should not have entered it." She directly mailed her leaflet to drafted men, and as we know from before, just expressing anti-draft sentiment in earshot of men of drafting age was considered treason and persecuted under the Espionage Act. "We do not counsel resistance," Olivero wrote in her leaflet. "We counsel but one thing, obedience to your own conscience. We do not ask you to resist the draft if you believe that the draft is right." Despite a long sentence, she only served a few months. The anti-capitalist movements of the late 19th and early 20th century brought a lot of anarchists and feminists. Unsurprisingly, for a lot of those in the fight for the liberation of the working class, the fight for the freedom of women was also on the agenda. Anarchists, like the socialists and pacifists of the time of the war, were fiercely persecuted. But here we get to my favorite anarcho-feminist, really one of my favorite women in history, Emma Goldman. She was a feminist icon, a fierce advocate for the workers' cause, a unionist, an orator, an anarchist, and in general a serious badass when it came to handling authority. She did throw water in a policeman's face once while being interrogated, but we'll get to that. Emma was born in Lithuania to Jewish parents. They moved to the US when she was 16. Like some others that we saw, she was radicalized by the result of the Haymarket riots. At 20, she worked as a seamstress, where she got a taste of the tiresome, low-paid, and dangerous factory work. There, she met the man that became her husband, but their marriage lasted only a year. She was the one that walked out of it, despite the disapproval of her family. It goes to show, though, her understanding of love and family, which was going strongly against the societal norms of the time. She was a strong proponent of free love and polyamory, and also a defender of sex work. In an essay in her Anarchism and Other Essays, she describes marriage as a prison for women, so much so that a woman is better off and more free being a prostitute. At least as a prostitute, she says, a woman has ownership of her own work. Emma Goldman herself made her living as a sex worker at times. She even expressed opinions against the inclusion of women in the workforce because she understood that that would make them do two jobs. Men were not going to step up with the housework and raising children. After her family basically disowned her after her divorce, she moved to New York, where she met a group of friends that shared her beliefs and causes. One of those friends was Alexander Berkman, Sasha, who would become her lover and lifelong friend. Their lives, personal and political, would become forever intertwined. A Russian-born anarchist, Berkman himself was swept by radical anarchist movements developing in Russia in the uncertain political climate of the late 19th century. In school, he joined the Radical Club for Revolutionary Literature, which was forbidden by the Tsar. Like many anarchists, he was an atheist. Once he submitted an essay titled "There is no God," which resulted in him being held back a year as punishment. At 18 years old, with both his parents dead and his brother moving to Germany, he decided to move to the United States. Russia was becoming less and less welcoming to Jews. In New York, he immediately became involved in groups advocating for the freedom of the anarchists involved in the Haymarket riot. Both him and Emma were strongly influenced by the speeches of Johann Most and his propaganda of the deed. And both of them would soon apply their own plans of direct action that will get them in trouble. Emma herself had many run-ins with the law. Her many speeches were not playing well with the authorities. At one time, she was detained for illegally distributing information about birth control. In 1893, she was arrested for inciting a riot. At that time, America was hit by an economic crisis and unemployment had risen to 20%. Demonstrations were common. Emma gave a speech in front of 3,000 people, encouraging them to demonstrate before the places of the rich. Demand work. If they do not give you work, demand bread. If they deny you both, take bread. Later in court, the prosecution claimed that she ordered the crowd to take everything by force, hence the inciting a riot charges. The detective on the case offered her a deal. He was going to drop the charges if she would inform on other radicals and anarchists involved in activism. Emma threw a glass of water in his face. In prison, she learned to be a midwife and nurse, skills that would be of use to her and she would work with for the rest of her life. A year prior, Emma, Sasha, and others in their group came up with an assassination plot. They were to kill Henry Frick, the manager of the Carnegie Steel Factory in Homestead, Pennsylvania. The Homestead strikes had taken the country by storm. After negotiations between the Steelworkers Union and the company failed, the workers were locked out of the factory. A strike began and strike breakers were brought in. On July 6, 1892, a gunfight between the guards and the workers broke out and it lasted 12 hours, resulting in 9 dead workers and 7 dead guards. There was nationwide support for the workers. This is when Emma and Sasha decided to do their propaganda of the deed. Berkman was to shoot Frick and Emma was to spread their message. He failed in his attempt and Frick lived. Berkman was arrested and sentenced to 22 years in prison. He would serve 14 of them, during which time Emma and him would keep communicating. There was even a plan to break him out of prison by digging a tunnel, but it failed. During Sasha's time in prison, Emma continued her activism and speech tours around the country. In the early 1900s, she began publishing a magazine called Mother Earth, held by Berkman after his release from prison, where they would publish essays by anarchists and philosophers, and would often write about activism, anarchism, sexuality, atheism, and other topics. After America joined the war in 1917, Emma and Sasha formed the No Conscription League, which, given by the name of it, encouraged the young men to resist the draft. As we've seen already, this was illegal, and both of them were convicted under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 2 years in prison, a $10,000 fine, and the possibility of deportation after their sentence was done, as they were foreign citizens. Their lives up to this moment are dramatized in historian Howard Zinn's play Emma, Emma Goldman also describes the events in her autobiography, Living My Life. Their release from prison coincided with the first Red Scare. On December 21st, 1919, Emma and Sasha, along with 249 foreign-born wartime prisoners, were loaded onto what the media dubbed the Soviet Ark, an old cargo ship, and deported to Russia. In the beginning, they were both happy with the development of the Bolshevik Revolution, but living in the Soviet Union in its immediate aftermath proved disappointing to them in many ways, including the fact that anarchists were also being persecuted under the new regime. They expressed their disappointment in Emma Goldman's My Disillusionment with the Russian Revolution and Alexander Berkman's The Bolshevik Myth. They left Russia, and in the next years they lived in different places around Europe. In his last years, Alexander Berkman lived in Nice. His health was deteriorating, and not being able to cope anymore, he committed suicide in 1936. Emma Goldman did the funeral arrangements. Berkman died just weeks before the Spanish anarcho-syndicalist revolution started. Emma writes in Living My Life that she wished he lived just a couple of weeks longer. Maybe the revolution would have inspired him to keep living. Emma Goldman died a couple of years later, in 1940. She was buried in Chicago near the graves of the Haymarket anarchists. Her tombstone reads, "Liberty will not descend to a people. A people must raise themselves to liberty." Although not as famous as Emma Goldman, Mollie Steimer's story shares a lot of similarities with her. She was born in Ukraine in 1897 and moved with her parents to the US at the age of 15, where she started working at a garment factory. She found anarchism through the works of Bakunin, Kropotkin, and Emma Goldman. In her early 20s, she, together with some friends from her little Jewish anarchist community, namely Jacob and Mary Abrams, started publishing anarchist works in Yiddish, including in 1918 a journal called Freiheit, for the German word for freedom. Their edition was banned due to the censorship of left and anti-war press, but it continued circulating nonetheless. The group distributed flyers calling for a nationwide general strike in an attempt to invoke a socialist workers' revolution in the States. Once, while giving out flyers in a factory, the group threw a bunch of them through a window, which alerted the police. Soon, their office was raided, and many involved were arrested and charged under the Sedition Amendment to the Espionage Act. The charge was for obstructing the war effort by criticizing the production of war material. The judge on their case was incredibly antagonistic to them, expressing nationalist sentiment and having recently lost a brother in the war. He was especially harsh towards young Mollie Steimer and her beliefs, asking her unrelated questions like her opinions on free love and marriage. Abrams versus the US, after Jacob and Mary Abrams, became one of the most important freedom of speech cases. The defendants appealed on freedom of speech laws, but were still convicted. Steimer was sentenced to 15 years in prison and a $500 fine. After fierce activism from other radicals and liberals, the sentence was commuted and the defendants were released on bail. Around that time, she met her idol, Emma Goldman, and they became lifelong friends. Mollie Steimer's activism did not stop there. While on bail, she kept protesting and advocating for strikes. She was arrested a number of times in the following year. In prison, she would be forced to do unpaid labor and work as a seamstress with nearly impossible to fulfill quotas. She would often go on hunger strikes to protest the conditions of solitary confinement. In 1920, she was finally released on the condition of her deportation. Steimer was deported to Russia on the Soviet Ark in 1921. Initially, she was happy with the Bolshevik Revolution, much like Emma Goldman, but soon she realized that anarchists were not welcome under the new regime and they were constantly being detained by the Red Army. In Russia, she met her husband Senya, a fellow anarchist, and they worked together to help imprison anarchists and political dissidents. Activism was not easy for them in Russia. They were exiled in Siberia but were released after carrying out a hunger strike. They continued their activism, but a couple of arrests and hunger strikes later, they were finally to be deported, this time to Germany. In Berlin, they reunited with Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. As you can imagine, they continued their activism in Europe. When Hitler ascended to power in 1933, wary of the anti-Semitic direction the country was headed in, they fled to Paris. When Germany invaded France, Mollie Steimer was sent to a concentration camp where she spent 6 months before being released. Finally, the couple was reunited in Marseille and they had fled to Mexico, where they lived into their 80s working as photographers. Continuing with the awesome anarcha-feminists, we get to Maria Key, a practicing doctor and nurse, an advocate for workers and women's rights, for birth control and abortion. Key's relationship with her partner, Harriet Speckert, that lasted over a decade, also led to them adopting a child, a daughter. That was one of the first cases of adoption by a same-sex couple, though her economic conditions did not allow her to have a so-called Boston marriage, a practice undertaken by wealthy lesbian women who decided to live together as a couple in private. In her medical practice, she focused on caring for women and children. She advocated for birth control and performed abortions at a time when both were illegal. She performed abortions on both rich and working class women, often charging rich women way more so she could cover the costs for the ones that could not afford it. She worked a lot with the industrial workers of the world, advocating for women's vote and an 8-hour workday. She also worked with Margaret Sanger on spreading information about birth control, and she never really got in trouble for her abortion and contraception activism. As an outspoken pacifist, she became involved in anti-war activism in 1917. Portland, where she lived, was taken over by nationalism and consequently a pro-war sentiment, so she was in a way an outsider with her political opinions. She quickly got arrested and convicted under the Espionage Act for sedition. She was sentenced to 3 years, which were reduced to 1 year by President Wilson, but she was released after 10 months for good behavior. In 2019, Maria Key was added to the honorees of the Rainbow Honor Walk in San Francisco's Castro neighborhood that celebrates LGBTQIA+ people who made significant contributions to their fields. There is also a queer-friendly bar in Portland called Doc Marie's after her. Soon after America joined the war, the Socialist Party held a convention where it declared its anti-war position. The party also declared its strong positions against wartime censorship of the press and mail, the restriction of the right to strike, organize, and assemble. I am a socialist, a labor unionist, and a believer in the Prince of Peace first, and an American second. If need be, I will give my life and the life of my mate to serve my class, but never with my consent will they be given to add to the profits and protect the stolen wealth of the bankers, food speculators, and ammunition makers. These words were Kate Richard O'Hare's in her speech during that convention. She also helped write the convention's resolution on war and militarism that declared the war a result of capitalist interest and reaffirmed the party's position on internationalism and class solidarity. Eugene Debs, who was sick and couldn't come to that meeting, wrote to her, "I cannot yet believe that they will ever dare to send you to prison for exercising your constitutional right to free speech. But if they do, then I shall feel guilty to be at large." She was arrested for that speech merely a month after the Espionage Act was passed. In 1919, O'Hare was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but was released a year later after a long nationwide campaign for her freedom. In prison, she met Emma Goldman. After she was freed, she continued advocating for others to be released. In April 1922, she led a march of the wives and children of the still imprisoned. They picketed in front of the White House for 2 months, holding signs like, "Debs is free, why not my daddy?" Many protests like this were happening at that time, and over the course of the next year, all Espionage Act prisoners were released. Socialist and anarchist movements were also brewing south of the border. Mexico was developing a revolutionary spirit at the end of the 19th century under the decade-long dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. A key figure of anarchist thought and action of the time, Ricardo Flores Magón, was one of Mexico's great revolutionary figures at the time leading up to the Mexican Revolution. From a young age, he was influenced by the works of Peter Kropotkin, Enrico Malatesta, Emma Goldman, and many others. The revolutionary anarchist journal Regeneración, which he published with his brothers Enrique and Jesus, with its strong criticism of Porfirio, got them arrested a number of times between 1901 and 1903. The editors of the journal, including the journalist Librado Rivera, were arrested in 1903 for hanging a mourning banner outside of their satirical edition El Hijo del Ahuizote, reading, "The Constitution is dead," referring to the 1857 Constitution. At this point, Porfirio Diaz had been in power almost constantly since 1974. While resisting the Porfirio regime, he was invited by Francisco Madera to join efforts and overthrow the dictator. Magon refused because he saw Madero's cause as simply political. It lacked the economic and social dimensions that Magon was hoping for the revolution to have. After his release in 1904, Magon fled to the US, where he continued the publication of Regeneración. From there, he founded the Mexican Liberal Party, the PLM, with his brother Enrique and Librado Rivera. Their platform was based on anarcho-communist ideals and propelled ideas way advanced for their time, like the abolition of state and private property and the introduction of the 8-hour workday. Magon's followers, the Magonistas, and their movement was strongly influenced and used as the basis of its ideas, Peter Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. Magon kept promoting armed struggle and an anarcho-socialist revolution against the ruling class. From LA, Magon continued his revolutionary agitation, contacting anarchists, socialists, and wobblies. He worked in close cooperation with the IWW. In 1911, the Magon brothers and Librado Rivera were arrested for violating the U.S. neutrality laws by promoting the Baja California Rebellion in Mexico, which was quickly crushed by the president's forces. 1911 was the year the revolution took down Diaz, and in November that year, Francisco Madero became president of Mexico. About that time, the PLM split ideologically and in action. The more moderate faction, the Maderistas, after Francisco Madero, started operating from Mexico City and published their own version of Regeneración. They distanced themselves from the more radical anarchism of the Magonistas, Magon's followers, which continued operating from California. From prison, really. Librado Rivera continued following his comrade Magon. From jail, they wrote a manifesto with clear anarcho-communist goals to distance themselves from the moderate liberal PLM faction in New Mexico. They called on revolutionaries to fight against authority, the clergy, and capital. After their release from prison in 1914, they continued publishing their version of Regeneración, even though it only operated until the following year due to lack of resources. After yet another arrest in 1916 for deposing indecent material in the U.S. mail, the Magon brothers spent 6 months in jail until the $3,000 bail fee was finally gathered by the efforts of none other but Emma Goldman and Sasha Berkman, who campaigned for them. Soon after, Magon wrote his play Tierra y Libertad.
Well then, what is needed is that there be no more rich, that we all be equal. And to accomplish this, there is but one method. We must seize from the hands of the rich the land, the houses, the machines, and make all of it the property of everyone.
In 1918, we finally get to the Espionage Act charges. As you would have probably guessed, their crime was conspiracy against the draft. At that time, Enrique Magon had left the PLM and the editorial team of Regeneración. Ricardo Flores Magon and Librado Rivera were convicted under the Espionage Act for their publications obstructing the war effort and sentenced to 21 years in prison. The action against Regeneración was a part of the larger campaign to suppress dissident and critical press in the US during its involvement in the war. It didn't help that they were foreigners. In addition to Germans and Russians, the FBI systematically harassed foreign-born labor leaders, arrested them, and often deported them. Ricardo Flores Magon died in his cell in Leavenworth prison 4 years later. He died suddenly of a heart disease despite previous reports of good health. Librado Rivera was released and deported back to Mexico in 1923. He continued fighting and criticizing the new government. Rivera also continued advocating for the release of other Magonistas detained in the US. Ricardo Flores Magon is celebrated as one of the precursors to the Mexican Revolution of 1911 that took down the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. His work with Regeneración is a testament to what the written word can do. It can put ideas forward, get people together, it can organize, and it can topple down regimes. This makes me think about the written word today and the spread of ideas. The media is long poised with corporate and political interests, but The independent media, the one that seeks to develop the world and society, needs to be protected because it can change minds and regimes. Mentioning Trump's case in the beginning was a bit of a red herring, sorry. In fact, his Espionage Act charges are an outlier in the use of the law today. I doubt that he'll ever be convicted of that. After all, the Espionage Act serves the establishment and punishes those questioning it. And Donald Trump is the establishment. During the First World War, a total of 2,100 people were indicted under the Espionage Act, and over 1,000 were convicted. More than 100 were sentenced to terms of 10 years or more. Not a single spy was caught. The Espionage Act came to be in a time of warmongering and a manufactured spy panic. Its confusing language would be discussed in courts for a century, especially in its relation to certain freedoms of expression. As we saw, all cases of Espionage Act convictions during and immediately after the war seemed to be crimes of wrong opinion, of dissent that would be in the way of the government's pursuit of war and preservation of an existing order. None of those convicted were working for a foreign power, and none had access to classified information. While there was significant criticism of the Espionage Act since it was established and throughout the war, what came after was stronger. After the war ended, people looked back at the way the law was used, the censorship of the press and post, and the many arrests for speech. Without outrage, discussions of whether the act is constitutional in relation to the First Amendment started anew, and the Sedition Act was removed. Even with the harsh sentences of 10 years or more, most of those convicted were pardoned within a couple of years, a testament to how irrationally the law was used during the war. In 1933, all Espionage Act convicts were offered amnesty by FDR, a belated acknowledgement of the wrongdoings of the US government in persecuting them in the first place. The Espionage Act would change significantly after the war, and it will never be used to repress speech in the same way again. And I'm sure it will never be used to silence media outlets again. These clashes over the role of censorship not only shaped the future of the Espionage Act, they also planted the seeds from which would sprout both the majesty of the modern First Amendment and the sprawling bureaucracy of the modern national security state. Between the two world wars and forward, we will see actual spies, in that spies that worked for foreign powers and that stole and shared classified information. The Espionage Act would later be used to strengthen the security state in the rise of institutions like the CIA, FBI, and the NSA, and that would create problems on its own. However, this is not how the story of the Espionage Act started. It started with silencing dissidents. It started with pressing down pacifist voices. And it's important to remember all that when we look at how it's used today.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But